When I smelled smoke at 2 a.m., I thought maybe it was a neighbor's barbecue gone wrong. But then I saw the orange glow pouring through my bedroom window. By the time I stumbled outside in my bare feet, my house, the one I built with my own hands, was already roaring like a furnace. And standing at the edge of my driveway, in her HOA badge and silk bathrobe, was Karen. She didn't look shocked. She didn't call 911. She just smiled. And here's the twist. Less than a week later, she waltzed into my courtroom like she owned the place, thinking she was about to win. But what she didn't know was that I had something in my back pocket, something that would turn her smug little grin into the face of a woman who just realized she's lost everything. You want to know how the most powerful woman in our HOA ended up running from the courthouse in tears? It all started with a rule about my fence and ended with fire. I will never forget the way she looked at me that morning. Chin tilted up like she was smelling something rotten, lips curled just enough to show the smallest sliver of teeth, eyes glittering with the kind of smug satisfaction only someone convinced of their own invincibility can wear. The air inside that courtroom was still stale from the previous day's proceedings, the faint scent of old wood polish and institutional carpet cleaner lingering in my nose. But my mind wasn't in that room. It was still on the ashes, my ashes, back on Willow Bend Drive, where my home had stood just 9 days earlier. I could still feel the phantom warmth of the fire licking at my skin, hear the groan of timber collapsing into embers, see the silhouettes of my grandmother's heirloom furniture twisting and blackening in the blaze. And there she was, sitting, 10 feet away from me, a pen in her hand, flipping through legal papers as if she hadn't personally reduced my life to charred rubble. Karen Whitlock. Every HOA has one, the self-appointed sheriff of suburbia. But this one wasn't just a stickler for lawn heights and mailbox colors. No, Karen had ambition. She was the kind of woman who saw a neighborhood not as a community, but as a chessboard. Every house and person a piece to be maneuvered. She had been president of the Willow Bend Estates HOA for 8 years, long enough to drive out anyone who questioned her vision and cement a circle of loyalists who would vote however she wanted. Her power didn't come from the official bylaws, though she knew them better than any lawyer I'd ever met, but from the fear she inspired. She didn't scream or throw tantrums. She smiled and wrote letters. And in Willow Bend, those letters had the power to empty bank accounts, ruin credit scores, and, in my case, destroy a life. When I first moved in 2 years ago, I didn't see it. The house had been my father's before me, and his father's before him. A sprawling, cedar-sided home with a wraparound porch and a workshop in the back where my grandfather had built everything from rocking chairs to fishing lures. It sat at the far end of the cul-de-sac, just past a stretch of oak trees that shielded it from the main road. It wasn't the most modern place on the block. My neighbors all seemed to favor the freshly painted carbon copy houses that the HOA adored, but it had soul, and for me that was enough. The day I got the keys, I remember standing in the driveway, running my hand over the warm wood of the porch railing, thinking how good it felt to be home. Karen was one of the first to welcome me. She came up the driveway in a crisp, white blouse and navy slacks, a binder tucked under her arm, and a smile that looked like it had been practiced in a mirror. "You must be Mark?" she'd said, her voice pitched in that careful way people use when they're sizing you up. "President of the HOA. I like to greet all our residents personally. Keeps our little community tight-knit." At the time, I took her at face value. She handed me a welcome packet, 63 pages of rules, regulations, and community expectations, and told me she'd be happy to answer any questions. I didn't know it then, but buried somewhere between the guidelines for exterior, paint colors, and the requirement that all fences be uniform in style was a clause Karen had slipped in years before. The HOA board had final say on any property maintenance concerns, a term vague enough to cover everything from cracked driveways to the way your curtains looked from the street. It was her weapon of choice. For the first 6 months, I barely interacted with her. I worked long hours running my carpentry business, and when I was home, I kept to myself. But then came the first letter. It was hand-delivered in a cream-colored envelope with the HOA logo stamped in gold. Inside, a formal notice. Your property is in violation of community guidelines due to non-uniform mailbox design. My mailbox, mind you, had been there since my grandfather's time. A sturdy black steel box mounted on a carved cedar post, the wood weathered but strong. It was beautiful. It was also, apparently, non-compliant. I replaced nothing. The fines began. At first, $50 a week. Then, $100. I appealed, and the board, led by Karen, denied me unanimously. That was my first real glimpse of her power. The board meetings were theater, with Karen as the lead actress. She would nod politely while residents spoke, take notes, then pivot to whatever agenda she'd already decided on. She never raised her voice, never let her mask slip. What I didn't realize, not then, was that my refusal to bend had painted a target on my back. Karen hated defiance, and she had a long history of making examples out of those who dared to push back. The letters kept coming, complaints about my porch light being too dim, accusations that my workshop generated excessive noise, despite the fact that I only worked during daylight hours. One even claimed the smell of cedar oil was noxious. Neighbors started avoiding me at the mailbox. A couple of them, quietly, told me they couldn't risk speaking up. They'd seen what happened to others who tried. Still, I held my ground. I paid the smaller fines under protest, refused the bigger ones, and documented everything. My father had always taught me, don't wrestle a pig. You both get dirty, but the pig likes it. I figured if I kept my head down, eventually she'd find another target. I was wrong. It was a Thursday night when I first felt the shift. I'd been in my workshop sanding a set of cabinet doors when I noticed the light from the street lamp flicker. I stepped outside and saw a shadow moving along the far edge of my property, someone ducking behind the hedges. When I called out, they froze, then bolted toward the street. I caught a glimpse of a figure in a dark hoodie, but it was too quick to make out more. The next morning, there was another letter in my mailbox. This one wasn't about a fine. It was a formal recommendation that I consider the market viability of my home, suggesting that increased property values could be achieved through redevelopment. Karen's signature was at the bottom in her looping cursive. That was when I started to suspect that this was about more than rules. There'd been rumors, whispered at the coffee shop, murmured between neighbors leaning over fences, about Karen's ties to a developer who wanted to buy up older homes in the area. The plan, supposedly, was to tear them down and build modern executive residences. My house, with its oversized lot and prime position at the end of the cul-de-sac, would be a crown jewel in that plan. And I wasn't selling. If I had known then just how far Karen was willing to go to get what she wanted, I might have left. I might have walked away, taken my memories and my tools, and found some quiet stretch of land far from the reach of any HOA. But I didn't. I stayed. And the shadow at the edge of my yard that Thursday night, that was the first whisper of the inferno that was coming. The first real crack in my calm came 3 days after that shadow slipped through my hedges. I woke before dawn, the air thick with the smell of wet earth from a storm the night before. Something about the silence felt wrong. Willow Bend was never truly quiet. You could usually hear the distant hum of traffic from the highway or the faint chime of a wind bell from a porch down the street. But that morning it was as though the neighborhood was holding its breath. When I stepped out onto the porch with my coffee, I noticed 2 things. The street lamp at the corner was still flickering, and someone had left fresh tire marks across the edge of my lawn. I followed the tracks with my eyes. They curved toward the workshop, stopped just short of the side gate, then backed out again. My gut twisted. No note, No delivery, just the tracks. I grabbed my phone and snapped a few pictures, sent them to the local police with a short message. Suspicious activity, recurring. They told me they'd add it to the report and hung up. I knew then I'd be on my own. Karen, however, didn't leave me guessing about her presence. That afternoon, she walked up my driveway wearing a coral sweater and white capris, holding what looked like a formal letter in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Without so much as a hello, she handed me the paper. Urgent violation notice, the heading read. This time, she claimed my unpainted workshop exterior posed a potential hazard to community cohesion and must be brought into compliance within 14 days. It was absurd even by HOA standards. The workshop had been painted the same deep barn red since my grandfather built it. When I pointed that out, she just smiled. Rules evolve, Mark, and some structures, well, they just don't fit anymore. I wanted to tell her exactly where she could put her clipboard, but I held back. She thrived on confrontation. Still, as she walked away, I caught something in her expression. A flicker of irritation at my lack of reaction, like she'd expected me to blow up. That was when the thought hit me. She wasn't just trying to inconvenience me. She was trying to wear me down until I made a mistake she could use. For the next week, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind through the oaks had me on edge. Twice I caught the same shadowy figure near my fence line, once even hearing the faint clink of metal against the gate latch before they bolted. I started locking the workshop every night and leaving my porch light on until dawn. It didn't help the feeling in my chest, that sense of being stalked in my own home. The night it happened, I'd just finished repairing a customer's dining table in the workshop. It was close to midnight, the air heavy and still, the cicadas unusually quiet. I turned off the lights and stepped into the yard, the damp grass cool under my boots. That's when I smelled it. Faint, almost masked by the scent of cedar, but unmistakable. Gasoline. My first thought was the lawnmower. I went to the shed, checked the canister, sealed tight. The smell was stronger by the fence near the side of the house. My heart began to pound. I rounded the corner, my phone's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Just the fence, the hedges, and the faint shimmer of something wet on the grass. I didn't see the flames start. I heard them. A muffled whump, like someone lighting a grill, followed by a low crackle. When I spun around, there was already a bloom of orange at the base of the porch steps, licking up the dry cedar boards. For a split second, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. It was too surreal, too fast. Then the fire leapt higher, the heat hitting me like a punch, and instinct took over. I ran for the hose, dragging it toward the porch, but by the time I got there, the flames had already climbed the railing, charring the wood black. Smoke curled into my eyes, making them sting and water. I tried to spray the base, but the heat was so intense I had to back up. Somewhere inside, a smoke detector wailed. I remember shouting, "At who? I don't know. Maybe at the fire, maybe at whatever shadow was slipping away into the dark as my life burned." The workshop went next. Sparks carried by the wind found the dry shingles, and within minutes the roof was alight. I could hear the sharp pop of glass shattering, the deep groan of beams weakening under the heat. Neighbors began spilling into the street, some shouting, some just staring. Someone called 911. Those minutes stretched into eternity. I watched the home my grandfather built, the home my father raised me in, turn into an open furnace. The fire danced through every room, devouring furniture, photographs, little pieces of history that no insurance policy could ever replace. The porch collapsed first, then the living room ceiling. Each crash was like a blow to the chest. When the fire trucks finally arrived, their sirens split the night wide open. Water hissed against the flames, steam billowed into the air, and firefighters, in heavy gear, swarmed the property. I stood there, drenched in sweat and smoke, my hands trembling, the hose still slack at my feet. A paramedic tried to guide me to the curb, but I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the windows, each one a frame for the inferno inside. Hours later, when the last of the embers were smothered and the trucks began to pull away, I walked. The blackened shell of what had been my home. The smell was everywhere. Acrid, oily, clinging to my clothes and hair. In the rubble of the living room, I found the twisted metal frame of my grandfather's rocking chair, half buried in ash. I picked it up, the metal still warm, and for the first time that night I felt the tears burn hot down my face. The fire marshal was the first to say it out loud. "We'll need to investigate," he told me, his eyes scanning the char patterns, along the porch. "There's signs this may not have been accidental." I knew exactly what he meant, and I knew exactly who I thought had done it. By sunrise, the neighborhood rumor mill was already churning. People whispered about seeing a car speeding away just before the fire. Someone said they'd noticed Karen at the corner earlier that evening, walking her little white dog. The HOA, meanwhile, sent an email to all residents reminding them about fire safety protocols and the importance of maintaining compliant property structures. There wasn't a single word of sympathy. If Karen had lit that match, or had someone do it for her, she'd made one mistake. She'd left me alive, and I was done waiting for the next move. I didn't sleep for the first 48 hours after the fire, not because I was in shock. That part had already passed somewhere between the porch collapsing and the last firefighter rolling up the hoses, but because my mind refused to stop running through every possible angle. Every creak in the darkness was a threat, every shadow a reminder that I was living on borrowed ground. The police had cordoned off the property, the yellow tape fluttering lazily in the breeze, but I knew that tape wouldn't keep the real danger out. Karen had escalated from harassment to destruction. The only thing left for her was to erase me entirely. I stayed with my friend Mike across town. Mike had been in Willow Bend once, back when his cousin lived there, and he'd told me flat out that Karen gave him the kind of smile people give when they're picturing you buried in their backyard. He didn't ask questions. He just handed me a spare key and said, "If you're gonna fight her, don't fight her on her turf. Make her come to you." But that was the problem. I didn't just want to fight her. I wanted to end her reign over Willow Bend entirely, to strip away every ounce of power she'd built. And to do that, I needed more than anger. I needed proof. The fire marshal's preliminary report landed in my inbox on Monday morning. Origin point, base of front porch steps, accelerant likely used, pending lab confirmation. There it was, in black and white. Someone had set this. I forwarded it immediately to the lead detective on the case, adding every photo I'd taken of the tire tracks, the wet grass, the shadow by my fence. But I knew better than to rely solely on the police. Arson cases could drag for months, sometimes years, without a clear suspect. And Karen was careful, too careful. That afternoon, I called in a favor from an old client of mine, a private investigator named Jeff Rawlins. I'd built custom shelving for his office 2 years back, and we'd stayed in touch. Jeff was ex-cop, the kind of guy who could find out where you'd had lunch 3 Thursdays ago and who you sat next to. When I told him what happened, he didn't even hesitate. "Send me her full name and a recent photo," he said, "and don't talk to anyone about what I'm doing." Jeff worked fast. Within a week, he sent me a dossier thick enough to rival a crime novel. Karen had no criminal record, but she had a history, a string of coincidental property, acquisitions tied to her tenure as HOA president. 3 former Willow Bend residents had sold their homes under pressure after mysterious safety concerns arose. All 3 properties later bought at below-market prices by a shell company, connected to a developer named Stanton Ridge Properties. Digging deeper, Jeff found that Karen's brother-in-law was a silent partner in that company. The pattern was almost too neat. Pressure, fines, mysterious damage, sale, redevelopment. And my lot? My grandfather's lot? It was the biggest inn. The cul-de-sac. A developer's dream. We also learned something else. 2 weeks before my fire, Karen had taken out a temporary insurance policy through a company called Glenford Mutual on my property. It was legal, barely, under some obscure HOA emergency management clause she'd slipped into the bylaws years ago. The policy listed potential fire risk mitigation as its justification. My lawyer friend said it was unusual but not unheard of, until you paired it with what happened next. The policy was scheduled to pay out directly to the HOA for community redevelopment purposes if a qualifying loss occurred. My loss, it was enough to make my blood run cold. She'd been planning this for months, maybe longer, but here's the thing about someone like Karen. Their ego is their Achilles heel. They believe they're smarter than everyone else, untouchable. I knew if I pushed just right, she'd trip herself up, so I played it quiet. I stayed out of Willow Bend, let her think I was licking my wounds, maybe even considering selling. Meanwhile, Jeff and I dug into Stanton Ridge's financials, looking for anything that tied the fire directly to Karen's personal gain. The break came from an unexpected place, an HOA board meeting recording. By law, Willow Bend had to record and archive all official meetings. I had a friend on the inside, a neighbor named Sheila, who'd always kept her head down but hated Karen more than she feared her. Sheila, accidentally, forwarded me an audio file from a closed-door board session held 3 days before the fire. The recording was grainy, but Karen's voice was unmistakable. He's not going to comply, and we can't afford to let that lot sit there another year. If something happens, we move quickly. The policy's in place. My hands shook as I replayed it. She never said the word fire, but the intent was clear as day. Combined with the insurance documents and Jeff's property acquisition timeline, it painted a picture so obvious even the most lenient judge would raise an eyebrow. That's when I made my decision. I wasn't just going to hand this over to the police. I was going to take it into a courtroom, my courtroom. See, what Karen didn't know, or had conveniently forgotten, was that I wasn't just a carpenter. Before I took over my family's home and workshop, I'd spent 10 years as a property rights attorney. I'd stepped away after my father's health declined, choosing to run the workshop full-time. But my license was still active. And if there's one place I'm comfortable going toe-to-toe with someone like Karen, it's under the eyes of a judge. I filed suit not just for damages to my property, but for fraud, abuse of authority, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We subpoenaed the HOA's financial records, the insurance policy, and the board meeting recordings. I knew she'd try to stonewall, and she did, but the beauty of civil discovery is that you can pry open a lot of doors people want to keep closed. The court date came faster than I expected. I walked into that room with a file box under my arm, wearing the same charcoal suit I'd worn to my father's funeral, not for sentiment, but because I wanted Karen to see I wasn't here for theatrics. I was here to bury her. And then she walked in, calm, collected, wearing a cream blazer and pearls as though she were attending a garden club brunch. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on me for the briefest second. No flicker of guilt, no sign of fear. Just that same measured smile I'd seen the day she first walked up my driveway. But I noticed something else, too. The tightness at the corner of her mouth. The way her knuckles whitened as she gripped her briefcase. Maybe she thought she was still in control. Maybe she thought she could charm the judge, dance around the evidence. She had no idea what was coming. The first gavel strike was sharper than I expected, the sound ricocheting off the oak-paneled walls like a gunshot. Judge Harmon leaned forward from his bench, peering at the room over half-moon glasses. He was the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved from the same wood as the courtroom furniture. Square jaw, deep lines at the corners of his eyes, no patience for theatrics. That was good. I didn't need a performance. I needed precision. Karen sat across from me at the defendant's table, flanked by two attorneys in tailored suits. One was a smooth-faced younger man with the overconfident smirk of someone fresh out of law school. The other an older, silver-haired litigator who'd clearly been brought in to project gravitas. Karen herself looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread for executive elegance. Cream blazer, pearls, hair perfectly sculpted into a blonde helmet. To anyone else, she probably looked calm. But I'd been watching her for over 2 years. The subtle twitch in her left eyelid, the way she adjusted her pearl necklace twice in a single minute. Those were tells. When the judge asked for opening statements, I stood, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the center of the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I simply laid out the bones of the case. A deliberate campaign of harassment by the Willow Bend HOA, led by its president, culminating in the destruction of my home by arson. I explained that while the criminal investigation was ongoing, this civil suit would show, through documented patterns and financial trails, that the defendant had both motive and opportunity, and that she acted with malicious intent. I ended with the simplest sentence I could manage. The fire may have taken my house, but it won't take the truth. Karen's attorney rose with a smile that suggested he'd heard it all before. He painted me as a disgruntled homeowner who'd refused to follow community rules, implying that my non-compliance had led to tensions with the board. He suggested that the fire was tragic but unrelated to any actions of the HOA, and that my accusations were emotionally charged speculation. Then came the evidence. First, I introduced the photographs, the tire tracks, the shimmer of accelerant on the grass, the char patterns on the porch steps. The fire marshal's report confirmed the use of gasoline and established the origin, point beyond reasonable doubt. Karen's lawyers didn't flinch, not yet. Next, I brought in Jeff, my investigator. He testified to the pattern of pressured sales within Willow Bend, the redevelopment of those properties, and the shell company's ties to Karen's brother-in-law. He spoke calmly, never embellishing, letting the facts speak for themselves. Karen's younger attorney tried to rattle him on cross-examination, suggesting the connections were coincidental. Jeff just smiled and said, "Coincidence is finding $1 in the street. This is a business model." Then came the insurance policy. I'd saved it for the middle of the day, knowing it would knock the wind out of her side's sails. I walked the judge through the HOA bylaws, pointing out the emergency management clause Karen had inserted years prior. I showed the timeline, policy taken out on my home 2 weeks before the fire, payout designated to the HOA for redevelopment purposes. The older attorney stood and objected, claiming the policy was a precautionary measure. I countered by playing the recording Sheila had given me. The grainy audio filled the courtroom, Karen's voice unmistakable, talking about my non-compliance, and that, if something happens, we move quickly. The policy's in place. The shift in the room was immediate. Even the judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. Karen's jaw tightened. She stared straight ahead, not at me, not at her lawyers. Finally, I called Sheila to the stand. Her testimony was the quiet knife that cut through whatever defense Karen had left. She spoke of board meetings where dissenting homeowners were targeted, of whispered conversations about problem properties, and of the growing hostility toward me in particular. She admitted she'd been afraid to speak until the fire. Karen's cross-examination was a disaster. Her younger lawyer tried to suggest Sheila bore a grudge, but Sheila simply looked at Karen and said, "The only grudge I have is against people who think they're above the law." By the third day of trial, Karen was unraveling. Her pearl necklace sat lopsided, her blazer rumpled at the shoulders. She stopped making eye contact altogether. When the judge asked her directly about the policy, she claimed it was routine, HOA business. When pressed on why it named my property specifically, she stumbled over her words, glancing at her attorney like she was searching for a lifeline. In my closing, I didn't attack her character. I didn't need to. I simply laid out the chain of events, each link tied to the next, until the picture was undeniable. A campaign of intimidation, a financial motive, an insurance policy, a fire. I ended with, she thought she could burn it down and walk away. Today, she learned she can't. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found in my favor on every count: fraud, abuse of authority, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages awarded were enough to rebuild my home twice over, but the money wasn't the victory. The real win came when the judge referred the case to the district attorney for criminal review. Karen's face as the verdict was read was something I'll carry with me forever. Not rage, not even fear, but the hollow look of someone realizing the walls they built to protect themselves are now closing in. In the weeks that followed, the HOA imploded. Board members resigned, residents called for dissolution, and Stanton, Ridge Properties pulled out of their redevelopment plans entirely. My lot sat empty for months, the charred footprint of the house a silent warning to anyone who thought power made them untouchable. I rebuilt, not the same cedar-sided home my grandfather built, but one that honored it. Wide porch, red workshop, out back, and a mailbox that looked exactly the way it always had. Sometimes in the quiet of the evening, I'd sit on that porch and think about the fire, about how close I'd come to losing everything, and how, in a way, it gave me back more than it took. Because the truth is, you don't beat someone like Karen by shouting louder or fighting dirtier. You beat them by dragging them into the light, piece by piece, until there's nowhere left to hide. And on that day in court, under the heavy gaze of the law, I watched her burn.